Hello everyone, and welcome to part 3 in our analysis on Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So just some quick reminders, do make sure that you've downloaded the worksheet for today, video number 14, but also that you've already watched video number 13 and completed the worksheet for that as well. So continuing then to look at the next set of stanzas in Poe's poem, we see here that again this narrative process continues. So it's good to make sure that on a summary level we comprehend what's happening. So in this first stanza you see that the narrator is opening the window and suddenly a raven walks in. And it's interesting because the raven has this attitude more like a regal or noble person than like an animal. And finally, this stanza ends with the bird perching itself on a bust of Pallas, otherwise known as the goddess Athena. We then move into our second stanza for this slide, and we see that the narrator is rather amused by the bird's appearance. Right? Remember, it's already been personified like a human being. But additionally, we also see that the narrator has some misgivings about where the bird comes from, and believes it to have come from hell itself. And when the narrator asks the raven what the bird's name is, the bird then replies, "Nevermore." So the narrator is obviously then surprised to actually having heard the bird speak, right? Remember, birds in reality do not speak, so it's very odd and strange that this one does. The next thing we do is make sure that the rhyme scheme we've established already in those first 6 stanzas of the poem now continues, and we see that it does, with the first and the third verses in each stanza being different from the rhyme created with the other verses in that stanza, so that A, B, C, B, B, B pattern. Additionally, I also need to double check my internal rhyme scheme to make sure that has not changed as well. And I see that it has stayed consistent, right? The first and the third verses having an internal rhyme. So shudder rhyming with flutter and made rhyming with stayed. I'm going to check each of those stanzas, right? Because remember, I can see a deviation away from that pattern, and I need to watch out for those. But here I see that in my next stanza that continues, beguiling rhyming with smiling, shaven rhyming with craven, and also in my third stanza on this slide, so ungainly and plainly, as well as agreeing and being. Additionally, this is good practice as well. Take a look then at that first verse and remember the meter that we found in our last video in those first 6 stanzas. We said that each of these verses is going to be divided into 16 syllables, and that it's going to follow a meter of trochaic, meaning beginning with stressed followed by unstressed. So I'm simply going to read aloud to myself and see if I find that. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter. So I see that it does in fact continue that trochaic octameter, meaning it is a trochaic meter of stressed followed by unstressed, and that in each verse I have 8 feet. So again, summarizing, now I've gotten into the rising action of my narrative. So I've already established my central character, but now I'm introduced to a new character, that of the raven. Also, I'm given more description about each of these characters, meaning the raven as well as the narrator, and at least how the narrator feels about this bird, this new character. I also see that my rhyme scheme continues as consistent throughout these next set of stanzas, and I can say the same about the meter, that it is continuing to be trochaic octameter. I'm then going to look at my second set of 3 stanzas for today's video, and again make sure that I can summarize what's going on, because as a narrative poem, if I don't understand the underlying story, then the deeper analysis is really going to be impossible for me. So I see here that the narrator is going to remark that the raven doesn't move, that it's flown onto this statue of the head and shoulders of Athena and just sits there. And the narrator is then going to remark that although the raven is here now, that eventually the raven too will leave, just like all of his other friends have left him. And the raven replies, "Nevermore." So the narrator again continues to be surprised by the fact that the bird is talking, but now at the reply, because that reply at first might seem to mean that the bird is going to stay with our narrator, something of hope. But quickly then the narrator does shift to this thought that perhaps it's simply the only word that this poor creature knows, that its former master, the person who owned it, lived such a miserable and terrible life that disaster after disaster befell them, and they would simply repeat this word, so much so that now the bird knows it as well. And then finally we end in this 12th stanza of the poem and see that the narrator is still intrigued by the bird, so much so that he pulls up a chair and sits in front of the raven, staring at it and trying to figure out, what does that bird mean by nevermore? Is it truly the only word that it knows? Again, I continue to look at my rhyme scheme and see that it has remained consistent. Additionally, my internal rhyme also remains so. So my first and third verse of each and every stanza is going to have internal rhyme. And I see that that remains the case for all of the stanzas on this slide. So my rising action then continues with my summary. I see that I have more background information now on my narrator, that he lives a very lonely existence. Not only has his lover died, but he claims that all of his friends have left him. And now he begins to become more intrigued with this raven, so much so that he begins to focus intensely on it. Additionally, the consistency of my rhyme scheme and my internal rhyme, which creates that free-flowing, soft beat to the poem, which then stands in contrast to that stress-inducing trochaic meter that we've been discussing. So analytical takeaways simply from the form of the poem alone. I know from my summary that I'm introduced to this new character, the raven. I also see that the rising action begins to increase as my two characters finally interact with one another, with the initial goal of the narrator trying to figure out what the raven really means by the consistent repetition of the word nevermore. Additionally, I see that my rhyme scheme has remained consistent. Additionally, here in these, my internal rhyme also remains the same. And again, the fact that I have no breaks in the internal rhyme or the overall rhyme scheme of the poem helps again really to lull me as the reader into this sense of security. I know what the sound is supposed to be, and my narrator and my speaker never deviate away from that. The same is true for my meter, that I have this consistent trochaic meter. And again, that this falling meter, meaning it begins stressed and ends unstressed, helps to, again, create that fear and tension that is going to stand in direct contrast with the smooth, free-flowing rhythm created with the rhyme scheme. Now I'm going to move on to literary devices and see, in addition to the form, what types of sound devices and figurative language do I see in the poem, and how does it add to my overall understanding and analysis of the raven? So just like in our last video, I'm going to start with the sound devices and highlight just a few examples that I see. Again, we're going to see Poe making excellent use of sound devices because remember, he's trying to create almost that fairy tale-like feel, that mysterious quality to the poem that sound helps to give. So I have examples of alliteration, flirt and flutter, that initial repetition of the letter F. Additionally, in that next stanza, bird beguiling, or bird and beast in the very last stanza on this page, the initial repetition of the letter B. I'm then going to look and see if I have any other examples of assonance, and I see that I do. An assonance, remember, is the repetition of a vowel sound that can occur anywhere in the word. So I'm going to look in my first stanza and I see flung the shutter, so that sound created with the vowel U being repeated. Additionally, looking down in my middle stanza, Plutonian shore, I have that middle repetition of the vowel O and the sound that it produces. Looking at the final stanza on this page, one example I see is help agreeing, that E sound that is repeated. And again, remember that part of the reason why Poe makes use of sound devices, and in particular assonance, is to help create that haunting, mysterious mood that we so clearly feel throughout the poem. And because Poe does not leave out any of these sound devices in his poem, he makes use of many of them. I'm going to also see consonants. And again, consonants is that middle or final repetition of a consonant sound. So looking at my first stanza on this slide, I see stopped or stayed. So the repetition at the end with the letter D. In the middle, shorn and shaven. Again, I have a final repetition of the letter N. And then here in the last stanza on this slide, agreeing that no living human being, that N and the G sound that's produced at the end. Having looked then at sound devices, I'm going to now turn my attention to figurative language. And just like last time, I'm going to start with imagery and see what sort of picture is Poe painting for me. And again, I see a picture that is not only dark, but also mysterious. So you constantly have these references to not only diction that we don't tend to use anymore, diction reserved for more ancient or at least long ago times. For example, such as your, right? This term then speaking of the past. So when he says days of past, speaking about days that are long gone. Additionally, mean of lord or lady, meaning simply the appearance of a lord or a lady. Both terms that we no longer use and that were more prevalent even in Edgar Allan Poe's time in the Middle Ages, right? So words that would have been distant for himself as well. I again continue to see these dark and rather haunting words being used. Ghastly grim, grave, reminiscent not just of grave meaning, again, stern that you see in that same verse, but also the literal grave where we go when we die, at least where our body goes. Additionally, this haunting and mysterious mood and atmosphere is propped up also by personification, because it's mysterious the fact that this raven is even able to talk at all. So you're going to see Poe repeat this in the poem, quoth the raven, simply meaning the raven said. Additionally, I also have several allusions, and here Poe is alluding to both Greek and, by extension, Roman mythological figures. The first that we see is Pallas, and I've already told you that Pallas stands for Athena. Not only is this an allusion, we could also call it an epithet, and an epithet is simply another name that is given to describe someone or something. So Pallas being an epithet or another name for the goddess Athena, who is known not just as the goddess of war, but also the goddess of wisdom. So it's going to be very interesting that Poe places his character, the raven, on the statue of Athena herself, by extension giving the raven certain qualities that Athena herself possesses, one of which being wisdom. So for us as the reader, should we give wisdom to the words that are coming out of the raven's mouth? Is he going to become some prophetic figure who our narrator needs to listen to? Additionally, when I look at that middle stanza, I see another allusion, the nightly shore, more specifically, night's Plutonian shore. And those familiar with Roman mythology would know that Pluto is the Roman name given to the Greek god Hades, god of the underworld. So again, allusions to the Greek ruler of hell himself. Remember, this is where our speaker believes the raven might be coming from. So in one stanza, I have an image of the raven being associated with wisdom, but then in the very next stanza, the raven being associated, in fact, with death and with hell. So he's definitely a figure that I need to keep my eye on. Furthermore, I have repetition. Repetition, again, to emphasize the raven himself. So the repetition of above my chamber door, meaning I need to focus on where my raven is. So a chamber meaning a room. So a room where I'm supposed to find security and peace. This is where this mysterious creature has come, disrupting my peace, in fact. And again, this repetition of the word nevermore. And interestingly, throughout the raven, you're going to see this word take on different meaning. So here in this middle stanza where it is being used, here it's being associated with the name of the raven. And then when I shift my focus and again repeat this word nevermore, it's the narrator reflecting on this word. Could this really be the name of this bird? And no one has ever really experienced this before, speaking with a bird, nonetheless a bird with such a strange name. Then I'm going to move to my last set of stanzas for today, and again going to pull out examples of alliteration, assonance, and consonants, and how all of this again helps to create that rhythmic, free-flowing feel to the poem that's going to stand at such odds to the very mysterious and at times dark mood and atmosphere that is created with the use of figurative language. So I'm going to dive in then with my figurative language, beginning with imagery. And again, I continue to see dark and mysterious language being used, but now images also of death and loneliness. And remember, our speaker has already told us as the audience that not only is his lover dead, but all of his friends have left him, right? So again, it makes sense that he would use this type of diction and create such lonely imagery. I continue to see the use of personification, more so now because again I'm focusing on the bird. So for example, in that very first verse, but the raven sitting lonely. Loneliness, right? Qualities of feeling, these are things that we associate only with human beings. So the fact that this bird is able to feel and speak are both great examples of personification. You also have this in the middle stanza here, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore. So again, attributing a feeling of melancholy or deep sadness to some inanimate idea, this idea of burdens. And while we're on the subject of this verse, I want to explain one particular word because it is so important to not only imagery, but when we get into metaphor in a moment. And that is dirges in that very same verse. And a dirge is a funeral song, something you would hear playing at someone's funeral. Again, we have the repetition of nevermore. So here in this very first stanza, we see that the bird is saying in reply to the narrator's thought that the bird too will leave him nevermore. And that here might be a sign, again, of hope, right? Although the speaker may not have any friends with him, the bird will now be with him. However, when I get then to my middle stanza and I have this repetition, it's important to take this repetition of nevermore into the context of what is being said. So in reply to the bird promising never to leave, the speaker says, doubtless, what it utters is its only stock and store, meaning that the bird is only saying this because it literally knows nothing else, and that it only knows this word because its unfortunate master was so miserable in life that that was the only word it had a chance to learn. And here we see that in repeating this word, the speaker himself seems to stutter or pause. Never, nevermore. And we need to wonder, why does he do that? Why not just simply say nevermore? And here, he's drawing our attention to something we already know, but maybe have lost sight of, that someone else in this poem is to be nevermore, the lost lover of our narrator, Lenore. And then finally, in this last stanza, we see the repetition of nevermore, now in a sense that the narrator is really going to dive in deep and try to figure out exactly what does the bird mean by saying this. And then finally, we finish up with metaphor. Again, a metaphor being an indirect comparison, right? So I'm not saying this is like something or it's as something. I'm being very around the bush about it. So, for example, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master whom the unmerciful disaster. Here, unmerciful disaster being a metaphor for talking about those things in life that are simply bad luck, things that are outside of our control, right? And I know that I should hone in on this word disaster because my narrator, my poet, has capitalized it. I see the same thing just a few verses down, to the dirges of his hope. And hope now being a metaphor for talking about all of these things that we wish for in life. And here, talking about the dirges of those hopes, meaning that all of this outpouring of nevermore has been a constant repetition of the dying of those hopes and dreams. So again, we shouldn't be walking away from the poem at this point and thinking that there's going to be an overall happy ending, because the narrator has been hinting to us throughout that although we might have moments of hope, ultimately that hope will not last. So just some analytical takeaways to wrap up today's video. We again saw the use of sound devices to create this constant rhythmic sound, and that although it is smooth flowing, it continues to be an overall atmosphere of melancholy. Additionally, the use of figurative language, specifically with imagery to create this sorrowful, mysterious, and dark picture, and the personification of the raven working to help firmly establish him as another character in this narrative. And then also, again, that changing, that shift in the repetition of nevermore and the new meanings it takes on, as well as the use of metaphor in those last set of stanzas to help explain the ominous use of this word. Finally, we talked a little bit about the tone and the mood and how this shifts slightly, right? The narrator becomes amused at the fact that the bird can talk, but never loses sight of the fact that it's a very dark word that this bird keeps repeating. And so it's going to prompt the narrator to really dig down deep and think, why is the bird saying this? Is this perhaps a warning for me? Or can I explain it away some other way? And again, how he quickly fades back into that uneasy and cautious feeling as at the end in that last stanza, he really begins to ponder, what is the bird up to? That is going to be it for today's video. In part 4, we will finish up the raven, so looking at those last set of stanzas. So do make sure that you download the worksheet for that video before watching. Thanks for checking it out, and see you tomorrow.